What drives a person to commit the unthinkable? What secrets lie buried in the places we least expect? A crime like this pulls us into a narrative that feels almost too dark to comprehend. It forces us to grapple with unsettling questions. How does a marriage, built on vows of love and commitment, descend into violence and betrayal? What events could push someone to take another life, and then go to such lengths to cover it up? These questions don't just linger, they demand answers, urging us to dig deeper into the story behind the headline. In the small, quiet corners of the world, where neighbors know each other's names and the days pass without much disruption, a crime like this doesn't just shock, it reverberates. The idea that such a heinous act could occur in an ordinary household challenges our sense of safety. It leaves us asking, could this happen anywhere? Could it happen closer to home than we think? The setting for this chilling story is Flagler County, Florida. To many, it's a serene escape, a community where life unfolds in predictable rhythms. Picture tree-lined streets, modest homes, and backyards that stretch into unassuming patches of woods. It's the kind of place where people feel secure, where the unexpected seems impossible. But beneath the surface of this tranquility, something was brewing. It began with a disappearance, followed by whispers of confusion and concern, until an entire community was gripped by a mystery that would soon reveal its darkest layers. One winter morning in February 2017, a husband and father, reliable, grounded, and well-liked, vanished without a trace. His sudden absence was as abrupt as it was unnerving. At first, those who knew him tried to rationalize it. Maybe he needed a break. Perhaps he was caught up in something urgent that prevented him from reaching out. But as days turned into weeks, the silence surrounding his disappearance grew deafening. For the people closest to him, the uncertainty was suffocating. They reached out to his wife, searching for clarity, yet her answers raised more questions than they resolved. Why did her stories about his whereabouts keep changing? Why did she seem so evasive, so unwilling to provide the simplest of explanations? It wasn't long before concern turned to suspicion, and suspicion led to fear. Law enforcement was eventually drawn into the mystery. They began with what seemed like a routine welfare check, knocking on the door of a modest home where, on the surface, nothing seemed out of place. But as officers asked their questions and observed the wife's demeanor, a subtle unease began to take hold. She avoided eye contact, her words carrying a strange mix of detachment and anxiety. Her explanations for her husband's absence were vague, almost rehearsed. The officers left that day with more questions than answers, but their instincts told them this was no ordinary case. Something was wrong, terribly wrong, and the deeper they dug, the clearer it became. The answers they sought would not be easy to find, nor would they bring comfort. Instead, they would uncover a horrifying truth, buried, literally and figuratively, beneath layers of deception. Enter Gormicki. The story that would emerge from Flagler County would not only shock the local community, but also captivate true crime enthusiasts across the nation. It's a story of love turned toxic, trust shattered, and the unspeakable acts that followed. And it all started with one question: where was he? Stay with us as we peel back the layers of this mystery, unraveling the events that led to a husband's tragic end and the lengths one woman went to in order to hide the truth. What you'll hear next will leave you questioning just how well we really know the people closest to us. Flagler County, Florida, was the kind of place where life had a predictable rhythm. The mornings were punctuated by the sound of sprinklers on neatly trimmed lawns and the occasional bark of a dog greeting its neighbors. Children rode their bikes on quiet streets, and residents waved to each other from front porches. It was a peaceful enclave where the unexpected rarely made an appearance. But in February 2017, that comforting monotony was disrupted in a way no one could have imagined. The catalyst for this disruption was the sudden and inexplicable disappearance of Charles Singer, a 48-year-old man described by friends and family as dependable, kind, and deeply rooted in his routine. Charles wasn't the type to disappear without a word. He loved his life in Flagler County, and though he was quiet by nature, those close to him knew they could count on him. When Charles stopped answering his phone, missed work, and failed to show up for a family gathering, it was more than strange. It was alarming. Charles and Harriet had become the only people on the online world who had any importance in it. At first, those who knew Charles tried to rationalize his absence. Maybe he needed a break. People sometimes did, after all. Perhaps he had taken an impromptu trip, needing to clear his head or escape the pressures of everyday life. But these explanations didn't sit right. Charles was steady and reliable, not the type to make impulsive decisions or leave without a word. Days stretched into weeks, and the silence became harder to ignore. Family members, increasingly worried, turned to the one person who should have had answers, his wife Dorothy. But when they reached out to her, they were met with an unsettling lack of clarity. Dorothy's explanations shifted with each conversation. One moment she claimed Charles had stormed off after an argument, fed up with their life and wanting a fresh start. Another time she suggested he was simply out of touch, possibly staying with a friend or traveling to an undisclosed location. The inconsistencies in Dorothy's stories weren't just troubling, they were baffling. It wasn't like Charles to vanish without a trace, and Dorothy's detached demeanor made things even stranger. While some family members tried to believe her, others couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. As concern mounted, the family decided it was time to involve law enforcement. Officers arrived at the Singer residence, a modest home set back from the road with a weathered porch and a yard that seemed to hold secrets of its own. Dorothy greeted them with a nervous smile, her hands fidgeting as she spoke. When the officers asked about Charles, Dorothy's answers were vague and unconvincing. She repeated the same disjointed explanations she had given to the family, but now they seemed even less plausible under scrutiny. Her tone lacked the urgency one might expect from a worried spouse. Instead, she appeared guarded, her words measured and her eyes darting around as if searching for the right thing to say. The officers took a cursory look around the house and the property. Nothing seemed obviously out of place, but there was an unsettling stillness that lingered in the air. Dorothy insisted that she had no idea where Charles was and dismissed any suggestion that something might have happened to him. Despite the lack of immediate evidence, the deputies left the house with an uneasy feeling. Something about Dorothy's behavior didn't sit right. Her demeanor wasn't one of grief or worry. It was something else entirely. They made a note to keep the case open, knowing they'd likely need to revisit the Singer home sooner rather than later. As days turned into weeks, the mystery of Charles's disappearance began to weigh heavily on the community. Rumors swirled among neighbors, each theory wilder than the last. Some speculated that Charles had run off with another woman, while others whispered about financial troubles or a dark family secret. But no one could have predicted the truth. A truth far darker and more chilling than anyone could imagine. Behind closed doors, Dorothy Singer was living a reality that would soon come crashing down. The whispers of suspicion were creeping closer, and the walls of her carefully constructed story were beginning to crack. The whispers surrounding Charles Singer's disappearance were no longer confined to the quiet streets of Flagler County. The rumor mill churned endlessly, each new theory more outrageous than the last. But behind the gossip and speculation, the local authorities were working tirelessly to uncover the truth. Investigators knew that time was critical. If Charles had met with foul play, every passing day made finding answers that much harder. The tipping point came with a single anonymous tip, a call to the sheriff's office that changed everything. The caller claimed to have seen something unusual near the Singer residence. A pile of brush and debris in the backyard that hadn't been there before Charles's disappearance. It was an observation seemingly small and insignificant, but enough to reignite the investigation with renewed urgency. Equipped with a search warrant, a team of officers returned to the Singer home. Dorothy's face was a mask of discomfort as she watched them approach, her once confident facade now tinged with nervousness. She tried to maintain an air of calm, but her fidgeting hands and darting eyes betrayed her growing unease. The officers methodically combed through the property, their footsteps echoing in the stillness of the early morning. The backyard, which had once seemed unremarkable, was now under intense scrutiny. The pile of brush, partially obscured by an old weathered John boat, drew immediate attention. It seemed out of place, almost deliberately constructed to deter a closer look. As the officers began removing the debris, a chilling reality began to unfold. Beneath the tangled mass of branches and leaves, something unnaturally solid came into view. The air grew heavy as the truth revealed itself. A body, wrapped hastily and buried shallowly, concealed from the world but not from justice. The remains were soon identified as Charles Singer. He had been shot multiple times, the wounds leaving no doubt that his death was not an accident. The positioning of his body and the crude attempt to hide him spoke of desperation, a hasty effort to cover up an unthinkable act. Forensic investigators descended upon the scene, meticulously documenting every detail. The discovery of Charles's body was horrifying, but the evidence left behind was equally telling. Bloodstains in the master bedroom suggested the murder had occurred inside the house, a brutal and intimate crime committed within the walls of the home they shared. As the details emerged, a grim picture began to take shape. This was no crime of passion, no impulsive act carried out in the heat of the moment. Every aspect of the scene pointed to premeditation, a deliberate and calculated plan to end Charles's life and erase his presence from the world. When questioned for the first time, Dorothy appeared calm, almost unnervingly so. She spoke of Charles as though his disappearance was just another minor inconvenience. She claimed he had left after an argument and implied he might have started a new life somewhere else. Charles always wanted to travel, she said, her voice steady but her eyes betraying unease. Maybe he finally got tired of this place and left, but as investigators pressed her for more details, the cracks began to show. Dorothy's accounts of Charles's supposed departure varied wildly with each retelling. In one version, he had stormed off after a heated fight. In another, he had mentioned going to visit an old friend. And in yet another, she said she hadn't seen or spoken to him for days before his disappearance. Footnote: detectives noticed that when confronted with pointed questions, Dorothy had a habit of deflecting, shifting blame, changing subjects, or outright denying things she had said earlier. What truly caught the investigators' attention was the way Dorothy handled the growing concern from Charles's family. Relatives, desperate for answers, had reached out to her repeatedly in the weeks after he vanished. Dorothy's responses were always vague. Sometimes she claimed he had called her briefly to say he was fine but wouldn't elaborate. Other times she suggested they should just wait because he would return when he was ready. These evasions didn't sit well with Charles's siblings, who described Dorothy's tone as detached, almost indifferent. As investigators followed the trail, they uncovered a pattern of deception that seemed almost rehearsed. Dorothy had told Charles's co-workers that he had taken time off for a personal retreat. To his friends, she suggested he was struggling with depression and needed space. But when detectives began interviewing those closest to the couple, a more troubling narrative began to emerge. Behind the carefully crafted image of a loyal wife, Dorothy's life was filled with contradictions. Financial records revealed she had recently drained one of their joint bank accounts. Text messages from her phone suggested she had been in contact with a man who wasn't Charles, though the nature of their relationship remained unclear. Even more unsettling, neighbors reported seeing Dorothy burning what looked like clothing in a backyard fire pit just days after Charles was last seen. The breakthrough came when investigators found a notebook tucked away in a drawer during a routine search of the house. The pages were filled with what appeared to be drafts of a letter. It wasn't until they read further that the chilling realization hit them. This was a suicide note, written by Dorothy. But it wasn't the content of the note that alarmed them most. It was its timing. The note had been written after Charles's disappearance. In the letter, Dorothy spoke about feeling overwhelmed, about the pressures of life and how she couldn't go on anymore. But the detectives weren't buying it. To them, it read more like a calculated move to stage her own death than a genuine cry for help. It seemed as though Dorothy had been planning an escape, one that would absolve her of responsibility and leave investigators chasing a dead end. As the evidence piled up, Dorothy's behavior became increasingly erratic. She stopped answering calls from Charles's family altogether, avoided neighbors, and seemed to retreat into herself. But the walls were closing in. By the time investigators returned with a warrant for her arrest, Dorothy was no longer able to maintain her facade. Her expression, once composed and confident, gave way to panic. Dorothy Singer was arrested on charges of first-degree murder. As the handcuffs clicked into place, the quiet community of Flagler County held its breath, waiting for answers to the questions that now consumed them. What had driven Dorothy to such an act of desperation? What secrets were buried in the past she had worked so hard to conceal? What came next would shock everyone. The trial would uncover layers of betrayal, cold calculation, and heartbreaking revelations that no one could have anticipated. The courtroom would become the stage for a story of love turned toxic, and the lengths to which one person would go to cover their tracks. The trial of Dorothy Singer captivated the nation, becoming a media frenzy almost overnight. The quiet, unassuming woman at the center of the case was now a symbol of betrayal and murder, her every move scrutinized by reporters, neighbors, and armchair detectives alike. The courtroom was packed daily, with spectators lining up to witness what would become one of the most sensational trials Flagler County had ever seen. The prosecution wasted no time painting Dorothy as a cunning and manipulative woman, driven by greed and desperation. They framed her as someone who had grown resentful of her husband, Charles, and saw his death as the only way to escape her mounting financial troubles and personal discontent. This was not a crime of passion, the prosecutor declared during opening arguments. This was a cold, calculated act, carried out by someone who thought they could outsmart the law. Dorothy, dressed in modest attire and sitting stiffly beside her defense team, seemed a shadow of her former self. She showed little emotion as the prosecution began to lay out their case, but her blank stare and occasional fidgeting betrayed a tension she could no longer hide. The prosecution introduced a slew of evidence meant to dismantle Dorothy's claims of innocence. Forensic experts testified about the blood found on the headboard in the couple's bedroom. A small, nearly imperceptible stain had been missed during an initial search of the home, but was uncovered after investigators returned with a more advanced luminol test. The blood, they revealed, matched Charles's DNA. The implications were clear. Something violent had occurred in that bedroom, and Dorothy had gone to great lengths to clean up the scene. But it was the testimony of Charles's younger sister, Linda, that delivered the most emotional blow to the jury. Tearfully, Linda recounted the phone calls and text messages she had exchanged with Dorothy in the days following Charles's disappearance. "She told me he was just out clearing his head," Linda said, her voice shaking. "I wanted to believe her, but something in her voice, something about the way she avoided my questions, it didn't feel right." The defense, however, was determined to spin a different story. They argued that Dorothy had not premeditated the murder, but had acted in a moment of desperation during a heated argument. Her lawyer, a seasoned litigator named Philip Garrison, painted a picture of a marriage riddled with tension and conflict. According to the defense, Charles was verbally abusive, and Dorothy had spent years feeling trapped in a relationship that left her emotionally battered. "Dorothy Singer is not a monster," Garrison insisted. "She is a woman who snapped under immense pressure." Garrison's strategy was to humanize Dorothy, to frame her as a victim who had made a terrible mistake in a moment of panic. But the prosecution quickly dismantled this narrative by introducing evidence of Dorothy's actions after the crime. They highlighted her meticulous efforts to conceal Charles's death, despising of the body, fabricating stories for friends and family, and even forging financial documents to access his accounts after his disappearance. These actions, the prosecution argued, were not the behavior of someone acting out of fear or desperation. They were the calculated moves of someone determined to get away with murder. As the trial progressed, a sense of suspense hung over the courtroom. The turning point came when the prosecution unveiled a previously undisclosed piece of evidence. A hidden compartment in Dorothy's car, discovered during a final sweep by forensic investigators. Inside the compartment was a small, blood-stained hammer, wrapped in a towel. The blood was later confirmed to belong to Charles. Dorothy's defense team scrambled to respond, claiming there was no concrete proof that the hammer had been used in Charles's death. But the damage was done. The jury's faces, once impartial and focused, now seemed hardened, their gazes fixed on Dorothy with a mix of disgust and disbelief. And then came the DNA bombshell. Forensic scientists presented evidence that not only tied Dorothy to the scene of the crime, but also revealed another shocking detail. Skin cells found under Charles's fingernails suggested he had fought back during the attack. The implication was clear. Dorothy's actions were not just desperate. They were violent and intentional. The defense's argument began to crumble under the weight of the evidence. But Dorothy herself remained an enigma throughout the trial, her face a mask of controlled emotion. She never took the stand, and her refusal to speak left an air of mystery around her true motives. The trial reached its climax during closing arguments. The prosecution urged the jury to consider the overwhelming evidence against Dorothy, from the bloodstains to the forged documents to the hammer. They reminded the jury of Charles's final moments, painting a picture of betrayal and brutality. Dorothy Singer betrayed the man who trusted her, the man who loved her, the prosecutor said. She tried to erase him from existence, but the truth has a way of coming to light. The defense, in its final plea, asked the jury for compassion. Garrison argued that Dorothy was a flawed human being, not a cold-blooded killer, and that the stresses of her life had pushed her to the brink. But it was clear that even he knew the odds were stacked against his client. The jury deliberated for 3 days, their discussions no doubt fueled by the complexity of the case. When they finally returned to the courtroom, the tension was palpable. Dorothy's expression remained unreadable as the verdict was read. Guilty of first-degree murder. The sentence was life in prison without the possibility of parole. As Dorothy was led away in handcuffs, the courtroom erupted in whispers. For the residents of Flagler County, the trial had provided answers, but it had also left behind a trail of questions. What had truly driven Dorothy to commit such a heinous act? Were there deeper secrets still hidden in the Singer household, waiting to be uncovered? While Dorothy's fate was sealed, the story was far from over. In the aftermath of the trial, a new mystery began to emerge. One that would cast doubt on everything that had come before. Dorothy's defense team, emboldened by newfound support and funding from advocacy groups claiming her trial had been biased, filed an appeal. They argued that the late introduction of key DNA evidence, the blood-stained hammer and the skin cells found under Charles's fingernails, had caught them off guard and denied Dorothy her right to a fair defense. They also pointed to procedural errors during the investigation, including how evidence was collected and preserved. The appellate court reviewed the arguments and, to the shock of many, agreed. In a rare move, they overturned Dorothy's conviction, citing significant procedural irregularities. Dorothy, now in her late 50s and visibly more frail, returned to court for what could have been a grueling retrial. Public opinion was split. Some believed her guilt was unquestionable, while others argued the justice system had overstepped in its eagerness to convict her. The atmosphere surrounding the case once again became charged, and the media descended on Flagler County like vultures circling a fresh carcass. With the possibility of a retrial looming, Dorothy's legal team advised her to consider a plea deal. Facing the prospect of reliving the trial's agonizing details and the likelihood of another guilty verdict, Dorothy took their advice. She pleaded no contest to second-degree murder, avoiding the uncertainty of a new trial. The plea deal carried a sentence of 32.5 years in prison, significantly less than her original life sentence. Dorothy would likely spend the rest of her life behind bars, but the agreement provided her a sliver of hope for eventual release. The plea deal brought some measure of closure to Charles Singer's family, but the scars left by his violent death ran deep. His younger sister Linda, who had become the de facto family spokesperson, expressed her mixed emotions in a televised interview. "I don't think there's ever going to be real justice," she said. "Dorothy will serve her time, but that doesn't bring my brother back. It doesn't erase the pain of losing him in such a horrific way." However, the plea deal wasn't the end of the story. As Dorothy adjusted to life in prison, whispers of another mystery began to surface. Anonymous tips to local media hinted that Charles's death might not have been the spontaneous act of desperation Dorothy's defense had claimed. Investigative journalists started digging deeper into the Singer household's past, uncovering unsettling details about the couple's financial dealings and personal lives. Through the power of cryptozoan, one shocking revelation came from a former neighbor who claimed to have overheard heated arguments between Dorothy and Charles in the months leading up to his death. According to the neighbor, Dorothy had repeatedly accused Charles of hiding money from her. These claims gained traction when reporters uncovered evidence of a secret bank account in Charles's name, containing tens of thousands of dollars Dorothy had no knowledge of. The discovery raised new questions. Had Dorothy killed Charles in a fit of rage after discovering his financial betrayal, or had she been planning to confront him all along? The lack of answers only deepened the intrigue, and the public remained fixated on the case. Years passed, but the shadow of Charles Singer's murder continued to loom over Flagler County. Dorothy, now a subdued figure in the state prison system, became something of a ghost, rarely speaking to anyone, avoiding interviews, and refusing to participate in documentaries about the case. Her silence only added to the mystery, leaving the public to speculate about what truly happened on the night Charles died. For some, Dorothy's conviction and plea deal represented justice. For others, they symbolized the flaws and complexities of a legal system that is often more concerned with winning than uncovering the truth. As the years went by, the Singer case became a cautionary tale, a grim reminder of how love, betrayal, and desperation can lead to tragedy. By the time Dorothy is eligible for parole, she will be an elderly woman, likely unable to rebuild the life she once had. The friends and family of Charles, meanwhile, will carry the pain of his loss for the rest of their lives. But perhaps the most haunting aspect of the story is the unanswered question at its core. Why did Dorothy do it? Was she a victim of circumstance, driven to the edge by an unfaithful and controlling husband, or was she a cold-blooded killer who carefully planned her crime? In the end, the Singer case remains an enigma, its twists and turns ensuring it will be remembered for years to come. And as we close this chapter, we're left with a chilling reminder: sometimes the truth is more elusive and more disturbing than we're prepared to face. If you believe justice should always be fair and thorough, subscribe to the channel. Only those who think justice doesn't matter would skip this chance. Let us know your thoughts on Dorothy Singer's case. Was justice served? Or are there still too many unanswered questions?